Look at them! Pathetic, aren't they? Still playing with rocks.
Adana, this is yours. It's beautiful, just like you. The crowd cheers and hails them.
In a world where value is often measured by what glitters on the surface, a humble village becomes the stage for a staggering revelation. When a sack of worthless grey stones is trampled into the mud by those blinded by greed, they unknowingly discard a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. This is a story of hidden brilliance, the weight of true respect, and the poetic justice that unfolds when the trash of the earth is revealed to be the heart of a kingdom. Witness the transformation of Adana from the overlooked sister to the queen of an emerald empire, in a tale where the most precious treasures are often found beneath the dust. The weight of an unfair fate. The sun in Olowo village did not just shine, it beat. It was the kind of heat that made the red earth crack like broken pottery. For Adana, the heat was the least of her worries. She stood at the edge of the village square, her wrapper faded but neatly tied, watching her two older sisters, Chinyere and Ifeoma, praying themselves like peacocks. They were waiting for the arrival of the wealthy cocoa merchant from the city, their necks adorned with plastic beads that they pretended were real coral. Adana, come and hold this mirror for me, Chinyere backed, her face white with excess powder. If I don't look my best today, how will a man of substance notice me? You, of course, have nothing to worry about. With that your face that looks like it has been fighting with palm wine dregs, only a farmer with one leg will look your way. Adana said nothing. She was used to the stinging words of her sisters. Since their father passed away, leaving behind a mountain of debt to the village elders, the house had become a place of sorrow. Adana spent her mornings scrubbing the floors and her afternoons in the bush gathering firewood to sell. Her mother, Mama Neka, sat in the corner of their hut, her eyes cloudy with cataracts and her heart heavy with the shame of their poverty. Suddenly, the village bell rang, gong, gong, gong. It was the summons of the chief priest and the elders. The debt was due. The entire village gathered under the great Iroko tree. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted corn and the nervous sweat of the villagers. The chief priest, a man whose voice sounded like dry leaves rubbing together, stood up. The family of the late Uche owes this village a debt that cannot be paid in yams or goats, he announced. To settle the balance, the youngest daughter, Adana, must be given in marriage to the man who helped the village during the Great Famine. A murmur went through the crowd. Who is this man? Adana's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected a rich chief, or at least a man with a large barn. But then, from the shadows of the market stalls, stepped Obi. The crowd erupted in laughter. Obi was the village shadow. He was a man who looked like he had been forgotten by time itself. His clothes were not just torn, they were a collection of rags held together by hope. His skin was perpetually dusted with the grey ash of a man who slept too close to the fire. Most notably, he carried a massive stained jute sack over his shoulder that clanked with the sound of heavy stones. This one, Ifeoma mocked, pointing a finger at Obi. Adana, you have finally found your match, a beggar for a bride. At least you won't have to worry about washing fine clothes because your husband doesn't own any. Adana looked at Obi. He didn't look back. He kept his head low, his eyes fixed on the red dust. He looked tired, older than his years, and incredibly lonely. While her sisters laughed and the villagers whispered, a strange sensation washed over Adana. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a deep, resonating pity. She saw his trembling hands as he gripped his massive sack of stones. I will marry him, Adana said, her voice small but firm. Her mother wailed, throwing her hands into the air. My daughter, is this how we end? To be joined to a man who has no roof that can withstand the rain? The elders didn't care for her tears. The contract was sealed. That evening, with nothing but a small bundle containing her 2 extra wrappers and a wooden comb, Adana followed Obi down the narrow, overgrown path that led away from the center of the village. The path grew darker as the trees leaned in close. The air here was different, cooler, smelling of damp earth and rotting leaves. Obi walked in silence, his breath coming in heavy rasps from the weight of his sack. He didn't offer to carry her bundle. He didn't even say hello. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a hut that looked as if it were leaning against the wind for support. The thatch roof was thin, showing patches of the darkening sky. There was no compound, no goats bleating in the background, just the sound of crickets and the heavy thud as Obi dropped his sack of stones on the dirt floor. This is home, Obi said. His voice was deep, surprisingly smooth for a man who looked so rugged. Adana stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single straw mat and a small hearth with 3 stones for cooking. Adana looked at her husband. He was already sitting on the floor, leaning his head against his heavy bag. I am hungry, Obi whispered. Adana looked at her small bundle. She had brought 3 small pieces of roasted yam her mother had hidden in her wrapper. She looked at the man the world had discarded, the man she was now tied to for life. She didn't cry. Instead, she knelt on the dusty floor, took out the yam, and broke the largest piece into 2. Eat, she said softly, handing it to him. Tomorrow, we will find a way to make this house a home. Obi took the yam, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. For a brief second, Adana saw a flash of something in his gaze, not the dull look of a beggar, but something sharp, ancient, and incredibly bright. But as quickly as it appeared, he was just a poor man eating in the dark. The silent burden and the mocking rain. The first few weeks in Obi's hut were a lesson in endurance. Every morning, before the forest birds began their early chorus, Adana would wake up to the sound of the heavy jute sack dragging across the floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a sound that had become the heartbeat of her new life. Obi never went to the village square to look for work, and he never went to the bush to hunt. Instead, his entire existence seemed to revolve around that mysterious sack of stones. Obi, Adana called out one morning as she tied her wrapper securely around her waist. The harmattan wind was starting to blow, bringing a thin layer of white dust that coated everything in the hut. The rainy season is coming. Our roof is thin like a widow's veil. We need to go to the market and see if we can trade labor for new thatch. If we don't, we will be swimming in our sleep. Obi looked up from where he was tightening the twine on his bag. His face was smudged with soot, and his beard was a tangled thicket of grey and black. I cannot go to the market today, Adana, he said, his voice low and steady. I have to take the stones to the river. I have to wash them. Adana paused, her hand frozen on the clay water pot. Wash stones? Obi, people wash clothes, they wash yams, they wash their bodies. Why would a man spend his strength washing stones that have no value? Obi didn't answer. He simply grunted as he heaved the massive weight onto his back. He looked like a man carrying the world on his shoulders, his knees buckling slightly under the pressure. Without another word, he stepped out into the morning mist. Adana sighed, but she did not let bitterness take root in her heart. She followed him. If her husband was going to be a man of stones, then she would be the woman who helped him carry them. Throughout the long trek to the river, she watched him. He moved with a strange deliberation, never complaining even when his breath came in jagged gasps. When they reached the riverbank, the water was clear and cold, rushing over the smooth pebbles of the shore. Obi sat by the water's edge and began his ritual. He would take out a stone, rough, grey, and unremarkable, and scrub it with a piece of abrasive leaf until it was clean of mud. Then he would place it back in the bag. While he walked, the sound of feminine laughter drifted from upstream. Adana's heart sank. It was her sisters, Chinyere and Ifelma, who had come to the river with their maids to wash their expensive lace garments. Look who we have here, Ifelma shouted, splashing water as she walked toward them. She was wearing a new set of gold-plated earrings that dangled ostentatiously. The queen of the slums and her king of rubble. Adana, tell me, is this the new fashion? Scrubbing rocks while your stomach is growling? I heard your mother had to beg for a cup of garri yesterday because her son-in-law is too busy playing with pebbles. The words cut Adana deeper than any knife. The thought of her mother begging made her eyes sting with tears. She looked at Obi, expecting him to defend her, to say something, anything to silence the mockery. But Obi remained silent, his eyes focused entirely on the grey stone in his hand. Leave them, Ifelma, Chinyere sneered, adjusting her silk head tie. Can't you see they are building a palace in their minds? Maybe if they wash those stones enough, they will turn into meat pies. Let us go before their poverty jumps on our expensive clothes. As they walked away, their laughter echoing off the trees, Adana sat on a fallen log and wept quietly. She didn't weep because she was poor. She wept because she felt alone in her struggle. When her tears finally dried, a rough hand was on her shoulder. Adana, Obi said. It was the first time he had used her name with such softness. The weight of a person's words only has power if you choose to carry them. Do not add their insults to your own burden. How can I not? She whispered. My mother is hungry. Our house is falling. And you only care for these stones. Obi reached into his bag and pulled out a small palm-sized stone he had just finished scrubbing. It was still wet, reflecting the midday sun. Help me carry this back. Just this one in your hand. Feel it. Adana took the stone. It was surprisingly heavy, much heavier than any rock of that size should be. It felt dense, solid, and strangely warm. For a moment, she thought she saw a glint of something deep beneath the grey surface, like a spark of fire trapped in a cage. It is heavy, she admitted. Everything of value is heavy at first, Obi replied. That night, the sky broke open. The rain did not fall in drops, it fell in buckets. Just as Adana had feared, the thatch roof was no match for the deluge. Water poured into the hut, turning the dirt floor into a pond of mud. Adana scrambled to move their meager belongings, the mat, the cooking pot, her extra wrapper, to the one dry corner. Obi didn't move to save himself. Instead, he threw his own body over the jute sack, using his ragged tunic to shield the stones from the water. Obi, you will catch a fever, Adana cried, trying to pull him toward the dry corner. Leave the bag, it is just rocks. No, he shouted over the roar of the thunder. The rain must not touch the heart of the bag yet. Help me, Adana. Seeing the desperation in his eyes, Adana gave in. She took her only dry wrapper, the one her mother had given her for her wedding, and wrapped it around the sack, helping Obi move it to the highest point in the hut. They sat together in the dark, shivering and soaked to the bone, huddling around a bag of stones while the storm raged around them. As the lightning flashed, Adana looked at her husband. He was shivering, his teeth chattering, but he was smiling. It was a small, secret smile. In that moment, surrounded by mud and cold water, Adana realized that Obi wasn't crazy. He was waiting for something. And for the first time, she decided she would wait with him, no matter how much it rained. The season of bitter harvest. The rain that had started as a blessing soon turned into a curse for the village of Olowo. For 3 weeks, the heavens remained open, washing away the topsoil and drowning the young cocoa plants that were the pride of the wealthy merchants. The river swelled until it burst its banks, swallowing the farmlands. In the village square, the mood shifted from mockery to desperation. Hunger, a guest that Adana knew well, began to knock on every door, even the doors of those who had once laughed at her. Adana sat in front of her hut, peeling the last of a few shriveled cocoyams she had managed to forage from the edge of the forest. Her frame had grown thinner, her collarbones tracing sharp lines beneath her skin, but her eyes remained bright with a strange, quiet strength. Beside her, Obi was busy as usual. He had found a piece of old deer hide and was using it to buff the stones he had washed during the rains. "Adana? Adana?" The voice was frantic. Adana looked up to see her sister, Ifelma, running toward the hut. Her expensive lace was stained with mud, and her gold-plated earrings were gone, likely traded for a handful of grain. She looked haggard, her face stripped of the arrogance that usually defined it. "Ifelma, what is it?" Adana asked, rising to her feet. "You must help us, Ifelma," she cried, her voice cracking. "The merchants have closed their stores. They say there is no more food to sell because the roads to the city are flooded. Chinyere's husband is in a rage because he lost his entire shipment to the river. We have not eaten a real meal in 4 days, Adana. Please, I know you are used to this life. You must know where to find food." Adana looked at her sister. Part of her wanted to remind Ifelma of the insult she had hurled at the river bank, but the sight of her sister's trembling hands stifled the bitterness. "I have only these cocoyams, Ifelma. Take half. It is all I have." Ifelma snatched the small tubers, but her eyes wandered to the hut behind Adana. "And what about him? What is he doing?" She pointed at Obi, who was sitting in the shadows, his hands moving rhythmically over a stone. "Everyone says he is a wizard or a madman. They say he hoards things in that bag. If he has food in there, tell him to give it up. The village council is talking about raiding the houses of those who don't contribute to the communal pot." "There is no food in the bag, Ifelma," Adana said firmly, stepping between her sister and the hut. "Please, go home." As Ifelma hurried away, Obi stepped out into the light. He looked at the retreating figure of his sister-in-law and at the meager portion of food left for Adana. "You gave away your life for her pride," Obi said quietly. "She is my blood, Adana. In our village, we do not let our own wither while we have a morsel." Obi sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "The time is coming closer, Adana. The village is reaching its breaking point. When a man is hungry, he does not look for justice. He looks for a victim. They will come for us because they cannot understand why we are still standing while they are falling." He was right. 2 days later, a group of young men, led by the husbands of Chinyere and Ifelma, marched toward their clearing. They were armed with stout sticks and machetes, their faces set in grim masks of frustration. They weren't just hungry, they were humiliated. They couldn't stand the fact that the village shadow and the beggar bride seemed unbothered by the crisis. "Obi, come out," shouted Chinyere's husband, a man named Okechukwu who was known for his booming voice and short temper. "We know you are hiding something in that hut. No man spends all day guarding a bag of rocks unless those rocks can be traded for yams. Open your door or we will tear it down." Adana stepped outside, her heart racing. "There is nothing here for you, Okechukwu. We are hungrier than you are. Leave us in peace." "Move aside, woman." Okechukwu pushed past her. The men swarmed into the small hut, tossing the straw mat aside and overturning the cooking stones. They grabbed the jute sack from the corner. "Here it is," a man yelled, "the stones of wealth." They dragged the heavy bag into the center of the clearing. Adana screamed for them to stop, but Obi held her back, his grip like iron. He wasn't fighting, he was watching. Okechukwu raised his machete and sliced the jute sack open with one violent stroke. Reap! The men crowded around, expecting to see dried meat, bags of rice, or stacks of currency. Instead, hundreds of grey, dusty stones spilled out onto the red mud. They were dull, irregularly shaped, and looked exactly like the rubble found at the bottom of a dried-up creek. Okechukwu picked a handful and threw them back at Obi in disgust. You truly are a madman. You live in filth and guard trash while the rest of us suffer. You have wasted our time and our energy. The men began to kick the stones into the mud, trampling them with their feet. They spat on the floor of the hut and cursed Adana for marrying a spirit of poverty. When they finally left, the clearing was a mess of trampled earth and scattered rocks. Adana sank to her knees, sobbing. They took everything we had left, Obi. They broke the door. They shamed us in front of the whole world. Obi knelt beside her. He didn't look angry. In fact, he looked relieved. He picked up one of the stones that had been kicked into the mud. He rubbed the dirt off with his thumb, and for the first time, he handed it to Adana. "Look closely, Adana," he whispered. She took the stone. Where the man's heavy boot had struck it, a small chip had flaked off the grey outer crust. Underneath the dull exterior was a sliver of something so green it looked like a piece of the forest canopy had been frozen into glass. It caught the evening light and sent a tiny brilliant spark dancing across her palm. It is beautiful," she gasped, her voice trembling. "It is an emerald, Adana," he said, his voice no longer the rasp of a beggar, but the steady tone of a man of authority. "And there are thousands of them in the mud around your feet. The men only saw the dirt because that is all they have in their hearts. But you saw the man behind the rags. Now you will see the kingdom behind the stones." Adana looked at the sea of grey rocks spattered in the dirt. She realized that for months she had been helping him polish a fortune that could buy the entire village 10 times over. "Why, Obi? Why did you wait for them to break the bag?" "Because," he said, looking at the horizon where the clouds were finally breaking, "the world must see the greed of the rich before it can appreciate the wealth of the poor. Tomorrow, Adana, we stop washing stones. Tomorrow, we start building." The morning after the raid, Olowo village woke up to a sound it had never heard before. It wasn't the sound of the village bell or the cry of the town crier. It was the rhythmic, synchronized thrum, thrum, thrum of heavy engines and the shouting of men in organized ranks. Adana stood in the center of their clearing, her heart leaping into her throat. Overnight, the muddy path to their hut had been transformed. Huge black trucks, the kind only seen in the big cities like Lagos or Port Harcourt, were lined up as far as the eye could see. Men in crisp white shirts and black suits stood at attention, their shoes polished so brightly they reflected the morning sun. "Obi," Adana called out, her voice trembling. "Obi, come out. The soldiers are here, or maybe it is the government." The door of the hut creaked open. But it wasn't the village shadow who stepped out. Obi had bathed in the middle of the night, using the expensive soaps the men in the trucks had brought. His tangled beard had been neatly trimmed, revealing a jawline as sharp as a warrior's spear. He wore a simple but incredibly fine white agbada made of silk that shimmered like the surface of a calm lake. "Do not be afraid, Adana," he said, reaching out to take her hand. His skin was no longer grey with ash. It was the color of deep, rich mahogany. "These men work for me. They have been waiting for my signal for a long time." A tall man with a briefcase stepped forward and bowed low, so low his forehead almost touched the red earth. "Director Obi, the coastal refineries are secured, and the international buyers for the emeralds have arrived at the city airstrip. The heavy machinery for the village development is on standby. We await your orders." Adana felt lightheaded. She looked at the ground, where the grey stones were still scattered in the mud. 2 workers were carefully kneeling, picking them up with silk cloths and placing them into velvet-lined cases. "I don't understand," Adana whispered, her eyes wide. "Who are you, Obi, truly?" Obi led her toward one of the large vehicles. "My father was a man who owned more land than a bird could fly over in a day, Adana. But he was surrounded by people who loved his wallet and hated his soul. When he passed, I saw how my own brothers turned into vultures, tearing the family apart for a share of the gold. I made a vow. I would hide my wealth in the dirt. I would live as the lowest of the low until I found a heart that was not for sale. He looked at her with a gaze so full of warmth, it made the morning heat feel cool. Many women looked at me and saw a beggar. My sisters-in-law saw a madman. But you, Adana, you saw a human being. You fed me when you were hungry. You protected my stones when the rain was washing us away. You carried the weight of my poverty, so now you will carry the crown of my wealth. The news spread through Olowo like a bushfire in the dry season. Villagers gathered at the edge of the clearing, whispering in hushed tones. They watched as the village shadow handed Adana a box. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside was a necklace of the very same emeralds they had been scrubbing by the river, now polished and set in pure, heavy gold. Among the crowd were Chinyere and Ifeoma. They pushed through the throng, their faces pale with shock. Their husbands, Okechukwu and his friends, stood behind them, their mouths hanging open like landed fish. They looked at the trucks, the security men, and the man they had kicked and spat upon only yesterday. Adana, Chinyere screamed, her voice high and desperate. Adana, my sister, I knew it. I always told Ifeoma that there was something royal about your husband. Please, tell him to forgive us. Tell him we were only joking when we raided the hut. Ifeoma stepped forward, trying to force a smile through her tears. Yes, Adana, remember how I brought you cocoyams? We are blood. Surely your husband has a place in his palace for his favorite sisters-in-law. Obi turned his head slowly to look at them. The air around him seemed to grow cold. The security men moved instinctively, forming a wall between the sisters and the couple. The cocoyams you brought were an insult, offered only when you feared I was hoarding food. And the joke you played yesterday was an act of cruelty against a man you thought could not fight back. He looked at Okechukwu, who was trying to hide his machete behind his back. You kicked my stones into the mud. You called my wife a beggar. You sought to destroy the little we had because your own greed was starving you. Obi waved a hand toward the trucks. I am building a hospital in this village. I am building a school and a marketplace that will never be empty. Every person in Olowo will have a job and food on their table. The villagers began to cheer, but Obi raised his hand for silence. However, he continued, his eyes locking onto the sisters and their husbands. There is no room in my house for those who only recognize gold when it is polished. You loved the rich merchant, but hated the poor husband. Therefore, you shall remain exactly as you are. You will watch the village prosper from the windows of your crumbling houses, and you will remember that the greatest treasure you ever saw was one you kicked into the dirt. Adana felt a pang of pity, but she remembered the tears she had cried at the river. She remembered her mother's hunger. She realized that Obi wasn't being cruel, he was being just. Come, Obi said, helping Adana into the back of the plush, air-conditioned car. We have to go to your mother's house. I promised her a long time ago that her youngest daughter would never know the taste of dust again. As the car pulled away, kicking up a cloud of red dust that coated the expensive lace of her sisters, Adana looked back at the small, leaning hut. It looked so tiny now, a shell of a life they had left behind. She realized that the stones hadn't just changed into emeralds, they had changed her. She was no longer the girl who took insults in science, she was the woman who had walked through the fire and come out as gold. The throne of salt and light. The arrival of Adana and Obi at Mama Nneka's house was a scene that the village of Olowo would talk about for generations. The dust had barely settled from the motorcade when the news reached the old woman's ears. She sat on her low wooden stool, her blind eyes turned toward the door, sensing a change in the air. The heavy, expensive scent of oud and sandalwood replaced the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. "Mama," Adana whispered, rushing into the hut and kneeling at her mother's feet. But this time, Adana did not smell of hard labor and sweat. She smelled of flowers and success. "My daughter?" the old woman asked, her voice trembling. "They say a king has come to my house. They say he has your face and the voice of a man who owns the wind." Obi stepped into the small, dim room. He knelt, not out of poverty this time, but out of deep traditional respect. He took the old woman's withered hands in his. "Mama, it is Obi, the one you gave your daughter to when the world said I was nothing. I have come to tell you that the debt is not just paid, it is erased. Your house will no longer be a place of shadows." Within hours, a team of specialist doctors from the city arrived. They worked with precision, and by the next morning, Mama Neka underwent a procedure that cleared the fog from her eyes. When the bandages were removed, the first thing she saw was her daughter, Adana, dressed in a wrapper of deep indigo velvet, her neck adorned with the emeralds of the forest. "I am dreaming," Mama Neka wept, touching Adana's face. "I am seeing a queen." "No, Mama," Adana smiled, her eyes tearing up. "You are seeing the fruit of a cool heart." The grand celebration was held 7 days later. Obi spared no expense. He commissioned the best cooks from across the region to prepare mountains of jollof rice, pounded yam that was as smooth as silk, and egusi soup rich with stockfish and dried prawns. The music of the udu and the igba drums vibrated through the very ground, making the leaves of the great iroko tree dance. The entire village was invited, but the seating arrangement was a silent lesson in morality. At the high table sat Adana, Obi, Mama Neka, and the poorest widows of the village, the women who had shared their meager grains with Adana when she had nothing. They were served on fine china, their glasses filled with sparkling juices and palm wine that had been tapped from the finest trees. At the very back of the crowd, near the edge of the clearing where the dust was thickest, sat Chinyere, Ifeoma, and their husbands. They had not been banned, for Obi knew that the greatest punishment was not exile, but being forced to watch the glory they had missed. They sat in their faded lace, picking at small portions of food, watching as the village shadow was toasted by governors and international businessmen. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that matched the emeralds in Adana's jewelry, Obi stood up to speak. The drums went silent. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. "People of Olo," Obi began, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the square. "Many of you wondered why a man would carry a bag of stones for so long. You thought I was guarding rocks. But these stones were a mirror. I carried them to see who would look past the dust to find the light." He turned to Adana, taking her hand in front of everyone. "Wealth is easy to find. You can dig it out of the ground or trade it in the market. But a loyal heart, a heart that stays when the roof is leaking and the belly is empty, that is the only treasure that does not rust." He then announced his final gift to the village. "I have established the Adana Foundation. From this day on, no girl in Olowo will be forced to marry because of a family debt. Education is free for every child, and every farmer who lost his crop to the floods will receive a new start. We will build a village where a man's worth is measured by his kindness, not the thickness of his thatch." The cheers that followed were so loud, they shook the birds from the trees. As the party continued into the night, Adana and Obi walked away from the noise, toward the river where they had once sat in shame. The water was calm now, reflecting the stars. "Are you happy, Adana?" Obi asked his wife. Adana looked at her hands. They were still calloused from the month of carrying the bag of stones, and she realized she never wanted those calluses to disappear. They were her medals of honor. "I was happy in the hut, Obi," she said truthfully, "because in that hut, I found a man who taught me that I was enough, even with a torn wrapper. The gold and the emeralds are beautiful, but they are just the clothes the truth wears. I am happy because the world finally sees you the way I always did." Obi smiled, and for the first time, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, unpolished grey stone, the very last one from the original bag. He handed it to her. "Keep this," he said, "to remind us of where we started." Adana took the stone and tucked it into her velvet wrapper, right against her heart. She knew that as long as she held on to the memory of the poor husband, she would always be the richest woman in the world. The village shadow had vanished, replaced by a king of industry and heart, and Adana, the girl who was forced to marry a beggar, became the legend of Olowo, the woman who turned a bag of stones into a legacy of love.